Hello to my air signs Libra, Aquarius and Gemini. Welcome to the Libra solar eclipse. You'll find the timestamps for your rising sign listed below. Hello Libra rising, welcome to your horoscope for the Libra solar eclipse happening on the 15th of October at 4:55 a.m. if you're in the Southern Hemisphere with me. And if you're in Australia with me, this is happening the morning after we vote on the 14th in the Indigenous Voice to Parliament referendum. Now, I'm going to be talking a lot about this in this reading. It's something that means, I imagine, quite a lot to the majority of Australians right now. This feels like a really pivotal moment in our history, and in our very recent past, there has been a lot of feelings, perhaps in relationship to trauma, about the growing hate speak, hate racist language that is infiltrating popular media and infiltrating the opinions, perhaps sometimes of our friends and family. What I want to do is to sort of have you think back to, if you can, the years 2004 and 5, because this was the last time that the dragon's head in Taurus shifted into Aries, the dragon's tail left Scorpio into Libra, that handover of the story. Because this is what's happening right now. We're sort of at the middle point. This Libra eclipse starts a new journey for us for the next 18 months. And the lunar eclipse in Taurus in 2 weeks from now finishes the story of the last 18 months. And so I remember 2004 and 5 quite vividly, because for me it was the first time that I was able to vote in an election. I had come of age a couple of years beforehand, but this was the first federal election in 2004 that I had some say in. And I remember reading and learning as much as I could about politics and really absorbing myself in my young adult education about these sorts of things, about government structure, about our place in the Commonwealth and all of that kind of stuff. I was really kind of trying to learn as much as I could about that. And so I placed my vote and I sat up with my friends at the time and we watched the count live on telly. In those days, the election was covered on all channels and you could sort of watch it live. Incredibly disappointing result from my perspective as a young person. The government, the Howard government that was in power, enjoyed its 4th term after this, the results of that election. And I felt for the first time that kind of disappointment in my body of not feeling that my voice was heard, of not feeling that the majority of the population saw eye to eye with issues that meant a lot to me. There was an incredible focus on the injustices for the Indigenous peoples in this country at that time too. 2004 and 2005 was a period of time when, after the long-standing government enjoyed a 4th term, there was profound injustice, which is Libra, the justice card, in relationship to abolishing standing government bodies in terms of suspending the Racial Discrimination Act in order to enact the Northern Territory intervention. I heard someone very recently say the only reason you suspend a Racial Discrimination Act is if you're going to do something racist. This was what we were living through. When we looked out on a global scale, we saw that George W. Bush was welcomed into his 2nd term in office. And we saw the commencement, or the crescendo, I should say, of America's war on terror. We saw the sort of growing bond between American politics and Australian politics. In fact, there was one point when George W. Bush commended Howard in the lead up to the election and condemned the leader of the opposition. That's one thing that I should probably mention too. The leader of the opposition at that time was someone called Mark Latham, who has since now, in hindsight, proved to be an incredibly racist individual and is riddled with homophobia as well. So there's a story here about the immediate results of something being disappointing, and then potentially, in hindsight, the longer term realization of benefit. So this brings me to a beautiful dissertation written by an incredible academic, Russell Charles Taylor, here in Australia. We lost Russell in April of this year, so I do hold my condolences in my heart as I talk about this. In 2017, Russell Taylor wrote an incredible dissertation about the 1967 referendum here in Australia, the immediate results of that, and then the results in hindsight for generations to come. As a young man, Russell was in the thick of the campaign for the change in referendum in 1969, which was to include the Indigenous peoples of this country into the count for the census of our population, and also to remove Section 51, which had some incredibly racist language and disallowed the federal government to enact laws for the Indigenous peoples of this country too. And so the way that the campaign was structured, it was a yes for the Indigenous peoples of this country, and it got a resounding yes. 90% of voters said yes. And Russell was a young Indigenous man and felt that moment of elation at the time of it coming to pass. But then almost instantly, in the coming months, a feeling of deflation, because as it stood, the Holt government, who put the referendum forward, took months to announce any active changes. It was given royal assent, I think, in August of the same year, the 10th of August, but then nothing happened. No ministerial statement was made until the 7th of September, at which point Holt declared in Parliament to the House of Representatives that pretty much things would stay as they were. It'd stick with the status quo and rely heavily on the states, or in the old days before Federation, the colonies, to enact laws based on their geographic location. So nothing had in fact changed. Faith Bandler, who was one of the pioneers of the act moving forward, the campaign moving forward, also described this feeling of deflation. In Russell Taylor's dissertation, he then goes on to say, however, the results generationally are to be really felt and really witnessed. And we can see that this act, symbolic as it was, enabled everyone to feel confident enough to stand up for their rights, to continue putting their voice in dissent when things weren't right, when things were unfair. And as far as campaigning, as far as grassroots organising of the rights for the people, this was something that could be seen. I'm saying all of this because it feels right now that there is an absolute decision that needs to be made by the Australian people. And some people are feeling uncomfortable about this decision. Some people are feeling that they shouldn't be the ones to make it. Unfortunately, it's a referendum for the Constitution, and that's the only way that change gets made in the Constitution. Also, it's something that no government coming up in the future can abolish or eradicate or remove. It's something that stays unless the people vote for it to change again. And so I'm saying this because in 2004 and 5, there was examples of rights stripped, organisations abolished, government funding cut off. There was a whole range of these sorts of injustices that played out in the Australian political atmosphere in regard particularly to Indigenous Australians, also to working class Australians, also to queer Australians too. It was quite a confronting time. If it's in the Constitution, it can't be removed, no matter what right-wing nut job gets into power next. So that's my perspective. I'm going to be voting yes. I'm going to be voting yes and not leaving it at that, though. We have to hold our government bodies into account for the promises that they have made. And so moving forward, moving away from this perhaps at times confusing atmosphere, perhaps confronting atmosphere, we're going to move forward and work with these eclipses, work with this justice card as much as we can, Libra rising. This is your soul card, one of them. So really hold that with you at this time. If we zoom out and think about American politics, these eclipses are lining up almost perfectly with your own journey to the next election. And you can see at the moment that justice is being served. Who knows what's going to happen, but I would like to probably bring in Pluto's influence in the astrology too. So Pluto has stationed direct on the 11th of October, so a couple of days before this eclipse, and Pluto is charging in the final degrees of Capricorn, which it has done since 2008. It has been disintegrating power structures, long-held power structures of control and authority. Capricorn can represent heads of state, our governing systems as well in global astrology. And so things like the Black Lives Matter movement occurred in these final critical degrees of Capricorn, the Me Too movement also. And now, as Pluto makes its final move before it heads into Aquarius in January of next year, it will be forming a square pressure with the dragon's head and the dragon's tail, and also this lunation, the sun and the moon at 21 degrees of Libra. So I'm keeping the faith, and I'm not telling you which way to vote. That is your decision. I am really urging you with empathy and with feeling to make an informed choice, to make a choice based on fact and truth, justice, fairness, and equity. In esoteric astrology, Libra has a soul mantra, and that is, I choose the way that leads between the great two lines of force. And I think at a time of such dissonance, polarity, extremism, radicalism, fascism, it's really important to hold our ground and to choose the way that leads between those great two lines of force in order to seek the truth. This is what Libra teaches us. This is part of your soul makeup if you're a Libra rising. This is something that's going to help us through. This is the first eclipse in a series of several over the next 18 months. So we're going to be working with Libra a lot. We're going to be working with justice a lot. We're going to be working with eclipses, which bring about shedding and bring about an influx of information over the next 18 months. So I hope and I pray that you feel safe and protected. If you're in Australia with me, I hope that you feel informed. There is multiple different pathways that you can choose to glean more information. Read about the voice, read about the genesis of this thing, read about its non-partisan nature, how it's got nothing to do with either side of government. It's not a government initiative. This is something that is independent and something that's been worked on. Countless hours have been spent on this thing over many, many years. If we leave things with no change, if nothing changes, then nothing changes. This is the time to make an informed choice based on the truth and not from propaganda. I refuse to believe that we're entering into a period of fascism. I cannot refute that enough. We have to stand clear, and sometimes we do use and stitch together passages of time from the past into our current reality in order to learn from that and to not allow things to happen again that were destructive and based in hate and based in cruelty. And as a Libra rising, this is your time, angel baby. You're going to be shedding. Your soul purpose is going to become clearer and clearer. So I salute you, my friend. Let's do this together, and let's hold hands, and let's hold our governing systems into account for the promises that they have made us. I will be speaking to you in 2 weeks for the Taurus lunar eclipse, the final chapter in the last 18 months of shedding and releasing and journeying to. So November of 2021 was the beginning of the story, and now we're coming to the closing of that chapter. So I'll be with you here to talk you through it. Much love to you, Libra rising. I adore you. You take good care of yourself. Ta-da. Hello, Aquarius rising. Welcome to your horoscope for the Libra solar eclipse happening on October the 15th at 4:55 a.m. if you're in the Southern Hemisphere with me. And if you're in the Southern Hemisphere with me, this eclipse is taking place the morning after we vote on the 14th of October in the Indigenous Voice to Parliament referendum. So I'm going to be talking heavily about the Justice card in this reading. In the tarot, Libra is represented by the Justice card. This is the energy of tarot that speaks to the astrology. And so we're thinking about eclipses, we're thinking about a shedding, we're thinking about dropping and leaving what is no longer the right way to behave or to think or to operate. And so the last time that the dragon's head was in Aries and the dragon's tail was in Libra was in the year 2004 and then also in 2005. That was the time actually that, much like now, the handover of the eclipses in Taurus and in Scorpio moved into the eclipses in Aries and in Libra. And so I bring this period of history up. It's quite pertinent for my own development. But 2004 was the first election that I was able to vote in. I had come of age a few years before, but it was the first federal election that I was a voting citizen, and I was very proud of that fact. And I spent a lot of time learning about politics with my friends who were much more educated than I was, but I really gleaned a lot of information from them. And I made an informed choice. And I sat with my friends at that time and we all watched the election results in real time. In those days, it was broadcast live, the count. I think it still might be. Anyhow, the results were revealed and the long-standing Howard government of Australia, which was very conservative and incredibly rigid, enjoyed its 4th term. So I was quite disappointed that it didn't work out the way that I thought that it would. As a young working class queer kid in Australia, I felt that I'm going to have my say with my generation, and I thought that it might go differently. Unfortunately, it didn't. In hindsight, the leader of the opposition at that time, of who I didn't vote for, but with the spill of votes, it would have been in their favour, was actually someone called Mark Latham. And in contemporary politics, Mark Latham has proved themselves to be an incredibly racist person who's riddled with homophobia. And so in hindsight, I can think to myself, well, at the time I was incredibly disappointed. Now, I think that that's something that probably shouldn't have happened for someone like that to enjoy a term as Prime Minister. Now, I'm not saying all of this to try and predict the outcome of this referendum. However, I am going to be talking to it quite heavily because I think that there is some other astrological significance that we can speak to as well. I believe that justice tells us to make an informed choice at times of referendum, which is when the Australian people have a say in changing the founding document of the country, which is the Australian Constitution that was written in 1901. It's quite young. We're quite young as a nation. However, this is an obligation, and change can only happen to this document on the people's say-so. There's been 44 referendums in Australia's federation, and only 8 of them have been approved by the people. It's different to a plebiscite, it's different to an opinion poll, as we were all dragged through in 2017 with the marriage legislation plebiscite, where the government asked us our opinion of what what do you think we should do? It was a waste of money, and it was really a time when a lot of queer folks felt that their rights were being put on display, and it felt really a time of quite rife injustice, and it was quite debilitating to our dignity, I found personally anyway. It was a success, and so the government then decided to write this legislation. But legislation is different to the Constitution. Legislation, laws, can be changed at any time depending on what government is in power, as I'm sure a lot of our friends in America can attest to, with the incredible violations towards reproductive rights in America and the laws that can be changed or suspended. The Constitution, as it stands, it's only the people that have the say, and the changes cannot be changed. There can be no changes made to these choices, no matter what government comes into power in our future. This is a moment where we have to, like the Justice card, inform ourselves and do what is right. We have to sift through the noise and a lot of the misinformation that is out there, not only in conspiracy theorist circles, but also in some popular media. There's a lot of disinformation, misinformation about this topic. So it really is our responsibility to find as much truth as we possibly can. I read an incredible dissertation by a man called Russell Charles Taylor, who unfortunately is no longer with us. We lost him in April, but he was an incredible activist, politician, and also academic. And he wrote a dissertation about the 1967 referendum here in Australia, which was passed with a resounding yes vote of 90% of the population voted yes. This referendum was to include the Indigenous peoples of Australia into the count in the census as part of our population. And it was also to eradicate a section 51, which had some incredibly racist language involved in it, and also disallowed the federal government to make laws for Indigenous peoples. So the way that the campaign for that referendum was marketed and poised and tirelessly worked on by somebody called Faith Bandler and a battalion of other incredible activists. But Faith was very diligent and had her face on the television quite a lot. The way that we received success is because that referendum was not it had bipartisan support. There was no division. There was no campaign for this vote. Also, it was sort of put in a certain context of human rights, which of course was the truth, and has since that referendum, it's proven its worth as far as people standing up for their rights and standing up for the rights of others, standing up for the Indigenous peoples of this country, also for other groups of people that need to be spoken to and listened to. So 67, the dragon's head and the dragon's tail were also in Aries and in Libra. We were having the handover from the eclipses in Taurus and Scorpio into Aries and Libra. There was things about justice and truth and equity and our responsibility to change in accordance with what is true and right and the honest thing to do. There was also a sort of compulsion towards Aries, which is far more individualist, but there is also the bright side of Aries is action, a call to action. In Russell Charles Taylor's dissertation, he does describe the feeling in 1967, the immediate feeling after that referendum result, as being a bit of a lead balloon, as being, oh, nothing has changed. He tells a lovely story actually about, I think it was his uncle saying, oh, we asked for the world and they've given us an atlas. I think that was, I'm paraphrasing here. But essentially he writes about the idea of really kind of seeing that nothing much had changed. And in fact, the referendum passed It was given royal assent on the 10th of August of 1967, but then it wasn't until the 6th of September, or the 7th of September, I should say, that the Prime Minister, Harold Holt, gave any ministerial announcement or lecture about the topic to reveal or to showcase the active changes that this constitutional change would bring about. And in essence, I read them all. I went through, I read all of their ministerial statements, and it turns out that Holt was pretty much happy to stay with the status quo. Nothing much did in fact change at that time. And so Russell tells the story of being a bit deflated. However, he also, in addition to that, tells the story of generations to come, seeing the benefit of that change as the generations moved by. So these three periods of history, 67, 2004 to right now, have similar astrology working with them. For you, Aquarius rising, Libra rules your 9th house, which is where we travel, expand our mind, make pilgrimage and journey to different lands. Also where we engage in academia and publishing. And so if the dragon's tail is there, there's going to be a feeling of shedding in that environment for you. I did say in the last horoscope that you might find yourself held in place at this time. If we look at the dragon's head in Aries, it's zoning in on your 3rd house of the goddess, which is our village, our homeland, our language that is developed on the land in which we stand. I like this symbolism at this particular time and at this particular eclipse, because I think that there has been, some have said, I don't understand why I'm voting in this. It's got nothing to do with me. A couple of things on that. As an Australian citizen, it does have something to do with you. And the effects of inactivity have proven themselves to be quite severe. If we do nothing, nothing will change. And things at this point in time have to change. If we look to 2004 and 2005, in that period of history, there was a laundry list, I've got them all written here, a mile long, of injustice, of rights stripped, of the Racial Discrimination Act being suspended for a time in order for the Northern Territory intervention to take place. I watched a documentary recently and they said the only reason that you would suspend the Racial Discrimination Act is if you were going to do something racist. In fact, they did. There was racial profiling, there was rights stripped to the point of an essentials card rather than any access to autonomy over one's finances in that community. Also, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission was abolished in 2005, and Howard, the Prime Minister at the time, declared it as a unsuccessful experiment at self-determination. You see, this hasn't come out of the blue, and it's not these issues that face a minority. 4% of the Australian population is Indigenous. However, this has been a protracted, ongoing injustice since this country was founded, since this country was invaded some 200 years ago. Things need to change. And at this time, and I'm not telling you which way to vote to, what I am urging you to do is make an informed choice based on the truth and not on propaganda. There is limitless resources that you can attain the truth. By using the astrology, I have taken myself on a journey back through just some of these marker points, but I tell you what, I could do more. The Libra energy, the Libra essence is justice. And in esoteric astrology, the mantra for Libra is, I choose the way that leads between the great two lines of force. And the way that I read that into this current climate is that polarity, that extremism, that fascism, that hatred that folks, some, I suspect a minority, but still it's a loud voice, and they feel entitled to start spewing this sort of hatred. That is not how a civilized culture operates, as far as I'm concerned. We choose the way that leads between the great two lines of force. We step away from this extremism, from this hurricane of hatred, and we do what's right. We make an informed decision, and it's up to you. I'm not telling you which way to vote. It's not my place to do so, but I am urging you from the essence of Libra to make an informed choice. I apologize, this is quite an Australian heavy horoscope, Aquarius rising, but it's now or never. That's how it really feels. I think if we zoom out and we take into account America's astrology, these eclipses are playing out at pivotal points of your journey towards election campaigning, and indeed the election itself next year too. So we can talk more about that at a later date. As it stands, we need to listen, and I think Aquarius rising, with this idea of the dragon's head being in your third house, that is a real invitation to listen. I think listen to people that have the energy and have the drive to talk on these topics. From my experience during the plebiscite, I found it exhausting, and I actually hibernated for a time because I felt that my straight friends were relying on me to have them make the right choice. My opinion about the topic was asked of a lot, and it was to have your rights being sort of put up for question was quite undignified. And so I imagine that the Indigenous peoples of Australia right now might be feeling that indignity. So go to the sources of information, of which there are countless, and make an informed choice at this time. That's your reading, Aquarius rising. I apologize there was no tarot. It's going to be just fine. And what we need to do is also hold our governing systems into account. When they make promises, we need to have follow through. It can't just be another ceremony and then nothing happens. I dare say that with this body enshrined in the Constitution, of which no one can abolish, those elected officials will have that on their major points of their agenda. Where to next? What now? How can we change this? Pluto in Capricorn is doing some amazing things for toppling down old structures of power. And that's probably where a lot of this fear is coming from. That sort of grip that was held onto so tightly. It's having to be moved. So we can enjoy that. We can enjoy the square, the pressure from Pluto onto this eclipse too. And no matter what happens, we move forward and we continue to demand active change. We continue to demand justice. I adore you, Aquarius rising. I'm going to be with you in 2 weeks, and we're going to discuss the final lunar eclipse in Taurus, which does have an effect on your fourth house of your home, your ancestry, your roots, your privacy. And so whatever has been occurring there for you over the last 18 months, we're going to have this final chapter and this final surgence into that part of your private worlds where you come from. Much love to you. You take care. Hello, Gemini rising. Welcome to your horoscope for the Libra solar eclipse happening on October the 15th at 4:55 a.m. if you're in the Southern Hemisphere with me. So if you are in the Southern Hemisphere with me here in Australia specifically, this eclipse is happening the morning after we as a nation vote on the referendum for the enshrined voice to Parliament in our Constitution. And what I've done is I've looked at the astrology of this moment in time, this pivotal moment in time, and I've relayed it to times gone by when there were similar configurations, particularly with eclipses. So the last time that the dragon's head in Taurus shifted into Aries, the changing over of the eclipse story, and then therefore the tail moving from Scorpio into Libra, the last time that this happened was in the year 2004. So 2004 and 2005 was that sort of changing of the guard, as it were, in terms of eclipses specifically. The movement from earthbound Taurus into Aries, which is radical self-determination, and Libra, which in tarot is justice. The idea of the tail shedding what doesn't work and reconfiguring, rerouting what does work in terms of justice. I remember this period quite vividly because I was quite young. It was the first election that I had access to. I had come of age a couple of years beforehand, and it was the first federal election that I could cast a vote and have my voice heard, in a sense. And I remember being really looking forward to it. And I had a beautiful group of friends at the time that informed me, educated me as much as they knew about politics. They were much more politically minded than I was, but I was gaining my language and really coming to understand the structures of society and things like that, and how these moments were very important for us to all engage in, because there is a sense of power in numbers, democracy in its finest incarnation. And so I remember casting my vote, and I remember sitting with my friends at the time and watching it all play out live on television. We sat up and we drank wine and we watched the count. We were all incredibly disappointed. Unfortunately, the result of that vote had the Howard government, the long-standing Howard government, who was in its third term, enjoy its fourth term, be elected into its fourth term in office at that election. And so we were deflated in that moment. We were like, oh, it felt quite unjust. In hindsight, the leader of the opposition at that time, a person who I didn't vote for, but who my preferences would be spilled to, was someone called Mark Latham, who in contemporary politics has proven themselves to be incredibly racist and incredibly homophobic. So in hindsight, I do think back to that election and my disappointment at that time, and can think, well, in the long run, perhaps it was better that somebody like that did not enjoy a term in office. That's one story. With these eclipses in Aries of self-determination, in Libra of justice, at that time we did see eclipses of justice. 2004 and 2005, I've got a laundry list a mile long here of the different injustices towards the Indigenous peoples of this country, also to the working class, also to the LGBTQ community as well. There was never-ending revelations of injustice, and it was at a time in my youth where I was rallying my political voice, and I was really learning and absorbing about as much as I could about justice and injustice, in terms of the Racial Discrimination Act being suspended for a time. This occurred in the fourth term of this government. I watched a documentary recently, and they said the only reason that you would suspend a Racial Discrimination Act is if you were going to do something racist. And indeed they did. There was the Northern Territory intervention at that time, and there was wild injustice that occurred in that part of the country, and in terms of that part of the population and their rights being stripped and altered and changed as under the guise of intervention. John Howard, the Prime Minister at the time, described ATSIC, which was the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, as being a failed attempt at a failed experiment at self-determination, and abolished that body in 2005 during these eclipses. If we zoom out and think about American politics, this was the time that George W. Bush was enjoying a second term in office after the election. This was a time of the war on terror. This was a time of America and Australia being intertwined in their political ideology. In fact, going so far as the Prime President of America recommending our Prime Minister around election time and condemning the opposition leader, something that seems quite unjust. I'm not saying all of this to predict anything, Gemini rising. I don't suspect that history will repeat. I bring this up because we use astrology to go backwards, to learn from it, and then to move forwards. Another period of history that the dragon's head was in Aries, the dragon's tail was in Libra, self-determination, justice, was in 1967. And this was one of the few referendums in Australia that was given approval by the Australian people. A whopping 90% of people voted in the affirmative at this referendum. This was called the Aboriginals referendum, to use the language of the time, and it was to include the Indigenous population of this country into the count at the census, so in fact we could have accurate representation of our population, and also to eradicate some language in Section 55, which was incredibly racist, and also disallowed the federal government to have influence or make laws for the Indigenous peoples of this country. It was a moment, an act of unification as symbol, and that's not refuted by any of the people on the campaign too, nor people who have written about that time after. There's a wonderful academic, Russell Charles Taylor, who's done incredible work in his life and career. Unfortunately, we lost Russell in April of this year. But in 2017, Russell wrote a dissertation called The Indigenous Constitutional Recognition, the 1967 referendum, and today. So it was a comparison. This was in the lead up to the Voice to Parliament, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, being formalised and presented to the Australian people. But Russell Taylor said, from memory at the time in 67, that there was a great feeling of hope and jubilation, and the campaign in the lead up to this referendum was one of great positivity, and the folks of Australia thought that they were in for some profound changes to the landscape, the cultural landscape. There was a lot of rallying. Faith Bandler was an incredible face of that campaign, and Russell tells stories of his grandmother being a great fan of Faith Bandler's. And so there was jubilation when it was announced on the 27th of May that the referendum had passed to a resounding yes vote. The complexity of this is that he also wrote about the immediate effects of that referendum, of which there was very little, close to none. Nothing seemed to change in Russell's life as a young Indigenous man, and nothing seemed to change in the lives of those around him. In fact, the government, Harold Holt, the Prime Minister at the time, held off from even making a ministerial statement enacting these changes until months after the referendum. It was given royal assent on the 10th of August, the royal signature, but then it wasn't until the 7th of September in which there was a ministerial statement made, of which I've read all of them. The Prime Minister makes one, and then two other candidates, forgive me, I can't remember exactly their names at this time, but there was three major statements made at this House of Representatives parliamentary meeting. And the Prime Minister essentially says that it's going to stick with the status quo, that the states will have major governing control over their Indigenous populations as per usual, and emphasise the fact of the amount of money that had been spent on these communities, and that there was a real astringency perhaps to his speech as far as having visionary eyes set on the future to move forward. It's quite jarring to read that statement. Kim Beazley Sr. also gave, it's hit my memory, Kim Beazley Sr. also gave a statement at that parliamentary meeting too, and it's quite moving. I suggest you read that one too. It sort of laments the reluctance to change from the Prime Minister. Anyhow, Russell Taylor also writes that was the immediate feeling after the referendum, but in generations to come, the effects of that referendum were absolutely seen from his perspective. He could see the growing confidence and dignity in the Indigenous peoples of Australia to stand up for their rights and to attest and contest acts by the government, to build council, to build structures for their future, to be, the symbology was not without its pertinence, is what I'm saying. And so we stand at this threshold right now, except this time the polarity of language in media, in public relations, the way that people are separated in their ideology so obviously right now. Part of that's to do with technology and the pokey machine. We will learn about whatever it is we choose to learn about at this time in history, and that's something that we have to be very aware of. And so if we choose to learn the truth rather than the propaganda, if we choose to learn the actual fact of the matter, if we learn our history, we've all got access to that. There is countless journals and websites and information that we all have access to. And I think that possibly as citizens of this country, it's our responsibility to learn our history before we start mouthing off about it. This time is pivotal, and this time is a period of eclipses in self-determination and injustice. So I want you to think about that, Gemini rising, as you move forward to this eclipse. I want you to keep in mind that Pluto, the planet of destruction, disintegration, of dredging things up from beneath the surface that need to be revealed and looked at, is in the final degrees of Capricorn. And in global astrology, Capricorn can represent governing systems, it can represent heads of state, authority figures. And so Pluto has been retrograde for some time. They're going to station direct, and we'll feel that wave of forward movement. We'll feel that effect of Pluto once more as it traverses the final degrees of Capricorn, forming square with our dragon. Square is pressure, square is attention. So this dragon is being affected by Pluto at this eclipse, which is different from our history. I suspect that no matter what happens, and I don't wish for a moment to tell you which way to vote, I wish to share my feeling that an informed choice is the only choice that we can make, one based in fact, truth, equity, and justice. In esoteric astrology, the mantra for Libra, which is justice, is I choose the way that leads between the great two lines of force. And I think at this time in our history, it's now more important than ever to hold that mantra in our back pocket and in our heart as we move forward. We can move through this tense polarity. We can move through this language of division. We can move through this. We can hold our governing systems into account when they make us promises too. This is not something that will happen, and like the eclipse, we move straight along to the next bit of astrology. This is starting something. This solar eclipse in Libra is the beginning chapter of a story that will play out for us over the next 18 months. And we have autonomy in interacting with what that might be. I don't wish for you to feel powerless at this time, Gemini rising. I wish for you to feel smart, and I wish for you to feel that you're making an informed choice. And I wish for you to make this informed choice and listen to people that are in positions where they have the energy to tell you about this stuff. I think that from my memory of the plebiscite, which is not a referendum, it was just an opinion poll, which was really degrading for a lot of the queer population here in Australia to go through. And there was a feeling of almost exhaustion because the polarity of opinion was being put on the public forum, and we were being asked to air our grievances about the LGBTQ community and their right to marriage. That legislation was passed. That was a law that can be taken away at any time from any government in the future. That's something to really remember. Constitutional change cannot. That's something to remember too. Much love to you. It starts here. Libra eclipse, justice, truth, fairness, equity. These are the words that I want you to meditate on as you wake up the morning on the 15th of October. I'll be with you in 2 weeks, Gemini rising, and we're going to talk about the lunar eclipse in Taurus, and that will be the crescendo of the last 18 months. So whatever story started for you on November of 2021 in relationship to your unconscious world, your dreams, your spirituality, your hidden work, the ways that you've been developing your emotional literacy and also your relationship with your mental health, your spirituality, that's going to hit another beautiful crescendo. This feels to me like a beautiful, beautiful time, as tense as it feels right now. So on that, I would encourage you also to unplug from time to time. You don't have to watch everything in real time, as we sometimes have the compulsion to do. It's vital to give yourself moments to rest and to sit in this moment and to feel a sense of safety in a world that sometimes can feel incredibly unsafe. Much love to you, Gemini rising. I'll be with you in 2 weeks. I'll see you then. You take care.